Hello again, fifth grade HAAS Nights. Ms. Wiehl here. Want to talk to you a little bit today, continuing our lesson about adaptations. But today I'd like us to finish off the PowerPoint. So we're going to focus on slides 28 through 32. So without further ado, let's jump right on into it. So as you remember from last week, we spent a lot of time talking about a bunch of different ecosystems. And these ecosystems were all related to land, right? So we talked about the taiga, the rainforest, the different types of forests, polar regions, deserts, grasslands, and a few others. But this week, we'd like to kind of stop and look back on adaptations of organisms that are living in the water. Obviously, we understand organisms living on land better because we live on land and we know what sort of structures and functions that we have in order to survive and to get our four basic needs. Remember, the four basic needs are we need air, water, energy from food, and shelter or protection. So as long as we can get those things, we're good. Now, I think it's kind of interesting that we're doing it in this order because many scientists actually believe that some of the oldest organisms that were ever found on this planet and fossilized evidence, we have actually fossils from organisms that existed over 4 billion years ago. So scientists actually believe that life originated. That means it started originally in the water, not actually on the land, which is pretty interesting and pretty cool. So we're going to talk about how on Earth life may have started and how organisms have adapted to living in aquatic environments. Okay. So what is an aquatic environment? Aquatic environments is anything that is in the water. So today we're going to be talking about organisms that live in the water. We can break down these aquatic environments into two major distincting groups. So we can talk about organisms living in a freshwater environment or organisms living in a saltwater environment. When we're talking about freshwater, we're not talking about fresh and clean water. The reason it's called freshwater is because it doesn't contain a lot of salt. Saltwater, you're probably thinking like the ocean, different type of seas that are that have a lot of salt water in them, and even there's sometimes salt lakes like the Great Salt Lake in Utah. So those would be salt or saltwater environments. But let's start off by talking about freshwater environments. So what are freshwater environments? They are usually, we think of like lakes, ponds, rivers, streams that don't have a lot of salt in them or don't have any salt in them. Okay, so when we're talking about freshwater environments, let's talk a little bit about lakes and ponds. Okay, so hopefully you're reading through this PowerPoint on your own, but if you are reading through, you can see that in these freshwater environments, we kind of break up these environments into different zones, into different parts, and organisms are specifically adapted to living in one of these different parts. Just like we're specifically, like an organism may be specifically adapted to living in one land environment, right? A cactus survives really well in the desert. It would not survive very well in the taiga, okay? So even though it is on land, right, there are many different environments in the water as well, okay? So when we're looking at freshwater environments, I want you to think of these 3 zones, okay? The first zone is called the near shore zone. And of course, it sounds just like what it is. It's near the shore. So if we're looking even in this picture, you can see a bunch of plants near the shore. Usually the near shore zone is very shallow, so plants can grow there. And of course, if there are plants there, there will be animals there because usually animals eat the plants. And if there are small animals there eating the plants, there will be larger animals eating those small animals. You'll find a lot of life in the near shore environments. As a matter of fact, I know that those plants in the image are called the American water lily, and they can grow in water that is up to 16 feet deep. So that tells me that if I don't see those plants, so further on in the image, you see that there's kind of just water and you don't see the water lilies, that tells me that it's deeper than 16 feet in those areas. So imagine we're swimming out into those areas. The next zone that you would get to is the open water zone. And you wouldn't find any well-rooted plants because the water is getting deep. And of course, plants with roots, well, they need sunlight too, right? So they have to be very long. So usually you won't find a lot of rooted plants, but you will find algae. which are usually small, oftentimes microscopic organisms that have the ability to do photosynthesis just like other plants. So as a matter of fact, some scientists believe that 95% of all the oxygen in our atmosphere was actually originated from algae, not so much the rainforest. So we really need to take care of our water environment, okay? You'll find a lot of fish in the open water zone as well. Think about when you go swimming, you're probably swimming in the open water zone of your lake or your pond. And once you start swimming in a downwards motion, heading down deep, you get to the deep water zone. And think about it, as you swim down, you start to notice that there's less and less sunlight because water doesn't allow sunlight to penetrate very deeply. So the deeper you go, the less sunlight you'll start to see. And if there's no sunlight, that means there's no plants because plants need sun in order to get their energy. So down in the deep water zone, you're not going to find as much light. You're not going to find as many plants. Okay? So just some things to think about on that end. Alrighty, let's keep going. Okay, going with the flow. So one other freshwater environment, and there can also be saltwater rivers as well. But oftentimes when we think of a river, we usually think of freshwater rivers. So rivers are characterized by the flow of the water. And as you can see in this image, the water is moving, okay? In the last image, you saw the water was pretty flat and pretty still. So rivers actually have water that is moving. And depending on how fast the water is flowing, depends on what sort of organisms can live there. Larger organisms that can swim very well could swim in a river if it's moving very quickly, such as river otters. As you can see at the top of the page, it says they have webbed feet for swimming. So they might actually be able to be found in a river that might be pictured here in this image. However, other smaller organisms, like maybe that tiny little fish that you see, might not do so well because if it's not strong enough to withstand the current of the water, it's going to likely get washed away, or maybe it'll get washed into a rock, hit into a rock, and maybe die or something. So you have to be adapted to living in water that is moving very quickly. Also, with the water movement comes what it does is it kind of turns up the rocks and the sand on the bottom of the river, and that makes the river a little bit less clear. So you can't see very well in rivers. And of course, if you can't see very well, if you can't see sunlight very well, that means probably not as many plants. So you don't find a lot of plants living in the water, but you might find if there's a slower area, more plants such as the moss and algae that's growing on the rocks, even at the bottom of the page. Okay. Actually, I want to go back. I want to show you guys a video of salmon migration. I know that we've talked about this in class a little bit, so I wanted to show you a little bit about this salmon migration. So I'm going to play this quick video from right here where it is, just a little bit, and talk a little bit about what we're looking at, okay? Okay. So as we can see, river, water's flowing very quickly, and these are the salmon. They're starting to gather because remember that they have a behavioral adaptation where they migrate at different times of the year. So what will be happening is these salmon are reaching adulthood and they're ready to reproduce. They're ready to have some babies. But of course, if they lay their eggs in an area where there's a lot of river motion, right? If they lay their eggs there, do you think that the eggs are going to actually stay in that one spot? Do you think those eggs will survive? Probably not. The water is moving much too quickly. So instead, what happens is the salmon will actually jump upriver. They will actually swim upriver. They will jump over waterfalls, even if they have to get to an area, usually the area where their eggs were laid and hatched, but usually an area in the river that's much slower moving water and much more protection for a baby. So that's the reasoning behind why they migrate. And actually, when I used to live in upstate New York, I would go every season to watch the salmon migration, and it is pretty awesome sight. So if you ever get the opportunity to check this out in real life, definitely make sure you get a chance to do that, okay? All right, so, oops. Sorry. back to our PowerPoint, okay? So that's a little bit about rivers. I'm going to stop this video here and upload it into 2 different sections so that we'll be able to continue on with this lesson about organisms that live in the water.